Hello Internet, hello Final Fantasy fans, I am Jackie Fox, and welcome to a special Christmas present for everybody. Since I made my last video for this channel, I have been chilling under kind of a homemade kotatsu in my living room and playing Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion. And this is a special experience for me because I never played the original, even though I would have had a PSP around the time. I don't know why I didn't, but I think maybe it got like some weird reviews. People talk some shit about the DMW system. I don't know. For whatever reason, maybe that was around the time my PSP broke. I don't know. I don't remember what the reason was, but I remember trying to emulate it on my phone, and it was kind of terrible, so I didn't want to do it that way. So I've kind of been waiting on a re-release, which we had long heard rumors that because the Popstar Gact was the basis for Genesis's 3D model in the game, that like there were copyright issues, and I don't know why they can't just pay this man a little bit and use him in the game, and I guess that's what they did, maybe. But anyways, I have a lot of thoughts about Crisis Core Reunion. Overall, I would say my score for it is probably a solid 6.9. As a Final Fantasy game. And a big part of the reason that it is not higher is the fact that Final Fantasy VII Remake exists. And that really colored my expectations for this game a lot. Even though we heard many times over that this is going to be more of a remaster, that this is more akin to Final Fantasy Type 0 HD Remaster. There's a release for console and PC, in that it was originally a PSP game, one, and that B, they didn't really do much but kind of reskin it a bit in some places, some of the cutscenes still being the same. I think they're decent, but still the same. I think they actually reused one or two from Final Fantasy VII as well. Maybe they retouched those a little bit for it too, but 6.9 because it's just not quite as good as 7. But at the same time, really good story. I've played through the story 1.5 times. I'm going through my hard playthrough now. And the first time I went through the story, I had a lot of issues with it, and I have a lot of thoughts on how to fix that. And that is why I'm making this video. As much because I want to talk about the game that I wish I was playing, and I want to talk about the game that I actually am playing. Because I think both are interesting, and this is still a good game, and maybe wait for a little bit of a discount because you are effectively playing a PSP game on a modern console at full retail price. So I don't know, that kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit, but it is a good game. And the story, while it takes getting closer to the end for it to really start to have a good emotional weight, which I think is an issue in the storytelling and an issue maybe in the segmented kind of portable way that they try to tell the story in more overt chapters. Like, yes, I get that later Final Fantasy games would also have chapters, and that you would have chapters in Remake, but some of those chapters happened in the same day. They were very fluid. It feels like even before the time skip towards the end, there's probably about 2 years of time unfolding, maybe something like that. It doesn't feel like this is all happening like relatively quickly, so it's kind of drawn out and protracted in some parts. And the Genesis stuff, all the Genesis copies, I just feel like there's too many of those, and that takes up too much time. That could have been a lot simpler, and you could have taken some of that extra time to fill in some of the side characters and really make them matter to the audience a bit more, because like of all the, it reminded me a lot of like the Deepground soldiers who kind of came out of nowhere for Dirge of Cerberus. And a lot of people kind of hated on that, but at least that was a project that had been going on for a long time and had the full funding of Shinra. It makes sense that they would have just ridiculous resources and all sorts of stuff. Hollander seems to be operating with one pod out in the middle of nowhere for most of this. How is he making so many Genesis copies of all various types all throughout this fucking game? How is that happening? And the NGO copies, like, it's just way too much work for one scientist without a team. And I realize, spoilers, he's getting money from Lazard. Lazard is, there are hints as early as I think the first chapter, or the first time that you go into the briefing room, that when they're explaining like little item drops that happen between chapters in the briefing room, they explain that there have been budget cuts, and that's probably because Lazard is extorting money, or not extorting. He is fraudulently removing their funds to prop up Hollander. But even then, we never really see like a big base or facility where he could be doing this stuff. It just seems like that whole chase should have been a little bit shorter, or a little bit different, and a little bit less reliant on tons of Genesis troopers. And also in my first playthrough, because there are so many of the missions in this game, and that's kind of a hearty chunk of it. It reminds me a bit of like some of the Metal Gear Solid games around that same time that had a bunch of VR missions in them to kind of pad them out in some ways. Like specifically some of the more portable titles, or the VR missions title for I think PS1. But aside from that, especially in the more drawn out Genesis parts where I'm kind of disengaging with the story a little bit, I find myself playing those missions more, which gives me longer chunks of time where I'm just not doing anything related to the main story at all. And I just felt really disconnected from like the second of the three kind of arcs of the story that involved Genesis. Like Wutai, get that. That makes sense. I'm glad I'm seeing some background into this conflict and how it ended and all that stuff. And then like the later stuff, the last arc makes a lot more sense and really starts drawing on some of those connections. But I think that my biggest issue here is that it is a remaster, and it is just a portable game that has been given a new life. And there were some very real limitations that were put on it from a story and a lot of standpoints because it was a portable title. And it wasn't just graphics. It was a lot of development things that could have been fleshed out in the same way that the first arc of Final Fantasy VII was fleshed out for Remake. And there's a lot of things in the game, like the DMW flashback memories that show up every once in a while in battle, that show you things that happened that you didn't see in stories that you may have participated in. Like the one that makes me... There's one really early in Modeoheim where Cloud picks off a monster that Zack thinks he's taken out, right? And kind of backs him up. Why can't I see that in the game? And a little bit more context around that. Like if half of the DMW memories were actually fleshed out into even a minute-long scene and actually put in the main game, that would have fleshed out a lot of characters. Like you would have gotten a lot more sense of depth for Zack and Aerith's relationship. And I'm not saying that they undersold that. And I'm not saying that the last moments of the game weren't incredibly meaningful for it. However, at the same time, I think a little bit more elaboration on that in the way that Remake did would have been helpful. And just expanding on some of those DMW memory scenes would have been great for that. I think Cissnei is also another character who really could benefit a lot from this, because it's almost... I feel like she's in love with Zack a little bit. But she's kind of... She's shy or doesn't want to say it. She really wants to feel comfortable enough to open herself up to him and reveal her real name to him. That's really important in her arc. And there's so many times that she bends like her codes and her, who she's supposed to be to save him or to help him, that it really feels like there's something deeper there. But the thing is, during the main story, we don't see them together that often. So it doesn't necessarily make sense why Cissnei feels this way towards him. Though, when that, you're getting further into the game, you're getting towards the end of the game, and you're unlocking a lot of these DMW memories, and you're seeing them for the first time, it actually starts to make sense why some of these characters feel the way they do for each other. But I think that that's inherently a problem if you have to wait until towards the end of the game to start understanding why the emotional connections are there. Like, Angeal is a really good example of this as well. Like, this story needs maybe a prologue section or something that is like just Zack and Angeal bonding and a little bit more backstory on them, because Angeal disappears after showing up like 3 times in the chapter at the end of chapter 1. And this is supposed to be the guy that I am supposed to have enough of an emotional connection to that by the end of the second arc, you know, it's emotionally impactful on me that I've killed my mentor. But, I mean, spoiler, sorry. But it doesn't really get there, because at that point in the game, I've seen Angeal maybe 10 times, right? And I'm halfway through the game. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more of an establishment of a baseline. Like, a game that did this really well, even though they would get rid of the character even earlier in the game, was Horizon Zero Dawn, with the way that they had the childhood segment that introduced Aloy and Rost, and then roughly at the end of chapter 1 we would lose Rost in the main story. But that scene fucking hit like that, because you got that glimpse of them growing up together, of him raising her. Him dying meant things that, like, I feel like I didn't get the impact of Angeal's death in the storyline until maybe like the wolf comes to protect me, because some part of Genesis is still loyal to protecting his subordinate even after he's passed on. Like, his cells will try to defend me, kind of thing. Like, that was beautiful. And the fact that I kept coming back to the church and that wolf was still there and I could still like yell at it and stuff, but the fact that it stayed, that became more emotionally impactful to me than, say, him saving me from VR Sephiroth, or him saving me from one of the big Hulkin Wutai guys. You know, that kind of hit for me. Or like, I got a better understanding in some ways of Angeal's character through the spoiler, Angeal mutated Lazard, who was kind of having a conflict between who Lazard was and who Angeal was, because those two ideologies were kind of battling in his head, and he was able to see a conflict between them and a contrast between them and see a different way that he could have been. But this also shows you kind of a different way that Angeal could have been, and showing you that contrast very directly there, I don't know, got me more in Angeal's head than his speeches about honor. Because you could see honor, like, just brushing up against the lust for revenge, and you could see the contrast there in a way. I don't know, like, there are a lot of characters in this game that are supposed to be meaningful to Zack, because, and this is one of the things I think the game does really well, by the way, in terms of story. And one of the things that I think puts it between story-wise, like between Intergrade as being just a short off story and Remake as being a segment of a story, a larger story, but also a really emotionally complete in its arcs for its characters. This is somewhere in between those two things, where I feel like a lot of those arcs are about half fleshed out. Or are fully fleshed out only when you consider the DMW memories and try to imagine some context around them. Which, again, it's interesting because, so, the reason I find Zack's themes throughout this, and the themes, like the ludonarrative themes of the DMW system, so interesting is because, like, think about this. Angeal and Genesis can pass themselves on through their cells. And I guess so can Sephiroth. And Sephiroth seems to be kind of, where they were talking about Angeal being like a receiver and a receiver and a transmitter simultaneously. Sephiroth is more like a transmitter. He can control his copies, or people who have been implanted with S cells through the whatever S program that Hojo cooked up. One of those being most notably Cloud, but also, even though we don't see Sephiroth interact or try to interact with Zack after he is implanted with S cells, which I assume he was alongside Cloud. So Zack may also be a receiver or set up as a receiver just like Cloud is as well. It just doesn't become relevant because he dies before Sephiroth comes back to start trying to manipulate him. But in the way that Angeal and Genesis and to an extent Sephiroth give parts of themselves and receive parts of others through genetics, Zack is a lot more around memories, or I guess you could say like memetics. It is the lessons and the stories and the memories and the experiences that he has had with people in combination with how close they are to him, and even how close they are to him in the moment or within the context of what scene you're in, right? Because of the heightened DMW, heightened emotions thing. So he is where many of these other characters transmit themselves through genes. He is in a lot of ways a receiver of memories and uses those memories in a way that reminds me a lot of Sonon, and the way that he's basically like a conduit for whoever he's fighting with, in the way that he interacts with and synergizes with Yuffie. He feels like he is a conduit of other people's powers. And where he has this in a more physical sense, Zack, I guess also has it in a physical sense because he could do an air raid somehow with a limit break, which is cool. I guess he calls Sing. I don't know. But Zack does it through memories. And especially once you get into the end and you start seeing how they use that in the final scenes, which really reminded me of like a near level psychological ludonarrative emotional twist. And I won't spoil it for you. It is my favorite moment in the game by far. And just something that really sold the story for me and sold the DMW system for me. And that being said, especially early on, the DMW system seems really overpowered. Just giving you like infinite mana for short periods of time. Because in early fights, even with weak magic or weak skills, that's enough to obliterate your opponents. And it kind of, if you're in a harder part of the story and you were kind of appreciating the challenge, that can obliterate the challenge early on a lot of times. I feel like maybe that system should have been a little weaker early on, and maybe something that improved in strength when you became first class, or maybe something that improved in strength when you unlocked Buster Sword or at different points in the game to kind of scale with the difficulty of the game. The other thing I'll say is that death kills pretty much everything. In my hard run replay, New Game Plus, almost everything that's not a machine or like a higher level Angeal copy or a demon so far has been one-hittable with death. Maybe some of the big Hulkin, actually some of the early bosses like the Wutai big dudes and Ifrit are weak to death too. The later ones not so much. And eventually I will get into a lot more of the missions and a lot more of the stuff where I can't just cheese it with death, but like, wow, a lot of this game is cheesable by death. It's kind of ridiculous in retrospect. Games that this reminds me of, though, and kind of where I think that this game fits, because I think that this game is an interesting stepping stone to the combat system that we would ultimately get in Final Fantasy Remake. And having not played the first one, I don't know what they did to revamp the combat system for this, or like change it, but what we got in this game in Reunion actually feels like playing a missing link between games like Final Fantasy Type 0, which I think has a much more fleshed out magic system in a lot of ways. Like, one thing that always impressed me about that game is Wall. I love the Wall spell in Reunion, but actually literally summoning a physical wall is such a cool idea. And I love the way that they had different types of magic within each magic, like shotgun, missile, rifle, bomb, etc., that you could do in every element. And they kind of do this in Reunion, but each element has its own thing. Like fire goes from at its more basic levels basically being a rifle spell or a missile spell, and eventually turns into like a shotgun cluster bomb, which is pretty amazing. I do actually dig that a lot. Lightning is very much shotgun style in that it has the short range, whereas all of the iterations of fire are pretty long range. And then Blizzard just drops ice on people's heads. They have to stand still for a second, and there's not really a parallel to that in any other game that I can think of, except for Final Fantasy Remake and the way that lightning spells work, except that lightning spells are basically instant, because this will just pop up over somebody's head in the same way that lightning spells do in that game. And then I guess there's like darkness and flare, which kind of work like bomb spells. But I think there's a lot of variety to being able to mix and match your magic based on element, type, level of power, etc., etc. I do like a lot of the things that are showing up in the higher end, like the hell spells or the dark spells, are both really cool. I just like things that spam status effects in addition to doing other stuff. It's the only way I'll use status effects, really, personally. But definitely another advantage that Type 0 has on this is cast of characters. And I think that that's another place that this game could have been improved by giving me new segments where I can actually fight alongside of some iconic characters. Like when I'm in Modeoheim going up the path, give me Cloud just shooting at things and giving me some support from the background. And then we can work in the DMW scene where he saves my butt. Maybe that's how he comes into the party. And then he fights in the party until we get into the bathhouse or something. Like, he doesn't even have to be in there long, and he doesn't have to be powerful. In fact, I would prefer that a lot of these characters are kind of weak, in the same way that we saw how weak Cloud was compared to Sephiroth in the dragon fight flashback from Final Fantasy VII. It would be pretty cool, especially if I had to kind of protect these people. Like, let's say Aerith has basically, like, Cura, Blizzard, because, canonically, like, the monsters around the church have generally been weak to ice, so Blizzard would make sense for her. And then maybe like Asuna, and that's all she can do. And if things aren't standing still for Blizzard, well, she's kind of useless for damage, and she'll just support you, and you kind of have to defend her, and you can physically get in front of her. You can, get in between enemies and her. You can protect her. And I think that would have added a lot of ludonarrative depth. And I think that would have added a lot of ludonarrative depth to a lot of these character relationships. Like, it also you could have had a tag team with Sing. You could have had a tag team with Cisne, and these could have actually showed how capable the Turks are. I mean, we do get to see Sing one-shot a couple of wolves with his Desert Eagle or whatever. And, the Turks seem pretty effective in the DMW flashbacks, but wouldn't it be cool to see how cool they are fighting alongside them? And on that note, give me another chance to fight alongside Sephiroth as an ally. This is a thing that was, again, a really unique feature of that one part of Final Fantasy VII. Let me do it again, really early on, let's say, to kind of show that, and maybe after you fought alongside somebody else who's pretty weak, like maybe that the level 1 guy that levels up, that's a soldier 3rd class, in that little mission chain where you're doing his missions for him. Maybe in one of those he tags along with you, and it demonstrates how much more powerful you are than even a level 7 3rd class soldier. And then after that, you can have a similar moment with Sephiroth that shows you, as Zack second class versus first class hero Sephiroth, and he's just wiping out things in front of you. And again, there is a DMW scene where this happens, I'm pretty sure. And just a lot of those things which were made bite-sized because it was going to be in a portable game, a lot of those things should be fleshed out. And I think that is another good way of doing that, and also demonstrating like how far Zack still has to climb to become a first-class soldier. But all of that being said, the two main things that I like about the Final Fantasy games that I really enjoyed are here. There is ultimately a good story and characters that are, if not kind of painfully close to the end of their arcs, relatable, and characters that I develop a connection with. But in addition, there's also a fun combat system. And I know I've talked about how it's also very similar to Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy 13-3, basically, which was kind of an odd game. Also one of the few Final Fantasy games where you're getting like a one-character show like this was. Even then, though, you get to team up with at least Fang, I want to say. So, like, there is even a team up in that game, which is a solo game. Yeah, come on, we could have, but that was also a console game, and to be honest, I really enjoyed Lightning Returns in a lot of ways. It was very different, but I think that it felt like it was a portable game. Like, it felt lower effort. It felt, I don't know, it didn't feel as big as other Final Fantasy games. It felt very small in a lot of ways, but combat system was kind of interesting. The time mechanics were kind of interesting, and the story was engaging enough, I guess, even though it didn't make any sense, especially since I didn't play Final Fantasy 13-2, or even finish the first one, I want to say, because I didn't really enjoy the paradigm shift system at all, because it felt too hands-off. But I can see how this game is an improvement over that combat system for sure, but also maybe a step below Type 0 in terms of flexibility, but still mechanically just as good as Type 0 as well, I would say. And that's probably one of my favorites other than Remake, which I think kind of took all the lessons learned from Lightning Returns and even 15 at this point, and put those into one of the most cohesive Final Fantasy combat systems, or just like magic skill inclusive combat systems, RPG, action RPG combat systems that I've seen. And this is very close to that, so it's still very good. And while it has its missteps, and while there are definitely a lot of ways in which it still feels like a portable game, one of the issues, one of the little quirks, is that there are a lot of scenes where the music is just a little bit too hyped for how loud the characters are, and it feels like it was a thing that was probably done that way to balance it for like the PSP's speakers. That doesn't make sense audio balancing wise on my laptop, but also should have been fixed before it was ported to console and Steam. Wow, that was a lot of talk. Now that I know what that is. And there's also the way that the story feels very segmented. Thankfully, I like the story here a lot more than Type 0, and I think it feels a little less abruptly segmented than that, which had its time limits and all sorts of weird things. In this one, I can just kind of fuck off for as long as I want at any point in the story and do side stuff as long as I can get to it, which feels a lot more free and open than Type 0, which felt like it was kind of forcing you through like a very rushed Persona experience in the way that they use time and give you limited options. It was that, it just wasn't unfolding over a very long period of time necessarily. In the same way that like Persona games take like 9 months of in-game time of you experiencing basically every day to get somewhere. But again, portable game. Though you know. Anyways, I think that these are all very important things to bring up now, because here's the way I see the collaboration of Final Fantasy VII for this generation going. It's going to be a lot more like the kind of Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's going to be phases, right? So we got the first phase with Remake, the core game, it's your Avengers title, you could say. And then you've got all of the side content. Something new, a new piece of side content, and a remaster. So we've had Intergrade and Crisis Core. And then we're going to get Rebirth. And I would imagine, because Dirge of Cerberus is kind of an epilogue, maybe, what was it, before Crisis gets a remaster in the after Rebirth, and then there is a brand new side content game like Intergrade for Rebirth. And then we get the third installment of the mainline Final Fantasy VII series, the final installment, a remake of Dirge of Cerberus, and another original, maybe bridge between the end of Final Fantasy VII and Dirge of Cerberus type piece of content. That's kind of how I see this going. So there's going to be at least 2 more remasters like this, and they're all coming from the same era, which I would say they're as old relative to now as the original Final Fantasy VII was when they started doing the collaboration. And it's just new enough in that it's 3D on 3D, unlike the 3D on 2D Final Fantasy VII original, that it can kind of be passed off with a new coat of paint. But the aspects of it that make it feel like a handheld game instead of a full console release are still there and can't just be fixed with a new coat of paint. So I really hope that this is a conversation that more Final Fantasy fans will have, and more maybe Squeenix executives will hear us having, and they might actually put a bit more effort into future remasters to make them feel less like PS2, PSP era games. And it's not even that would have been bad, because Final Fantasy X was a PS2 era game and it was great. But it's obvious that more effort was put into 10 than into a game like Dirge of Cerberus, which felt like it could have probably been a PSP game. Just saying. Reminded me a lot of Gungrave, I think. Anyways, those are my thoughts on Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion. It is a good game. If you haven't played the original, if you have, there's nothing new here, really. And I can't say that. It seems like there's nothing new here. I could be wrong because I didn't play the original, but it feels like the same game. If there are differences, I don't think you'll notice them that much. Just, you've already played this game, I guess. And currently, to be honest, with the fact that it is just kind of a new coat of paint on it, I think that the price that it's currently at, like $50, it's too much. $30 makes sense to me. This is a re-release. It is, you can tack Reunion on it, but it is an HD remaster. That's all it is. So, but that's probably what you should expect going into it, even before you hear me say this. It's what I was warned many times over the last couple of months that it would be. But at the same time, that does not stop me from griping and having higher expectations than that, even if I knew that this was what it was going to be. Because knowing that it could have been fleshed out, being conscious of that while I played it, gave me all of these ideas and all these ways that with just little tweaks, it could be made so much better and so much more modern and so much more console-worthy an experience. So, with all of that being said, I'm going to cut this short now. Short, right? It's like 35 minutes. and wish you a Merry Christmas so that I can actually probably get this up on the day I intend. See you next time.